Hello and welcome to the late word on Spurs. Ever so sorry for those thousands and thousands that are waiting in the back end there. We are here. We have woken up. We are apparently in a transfer window, and hopefully we've got some exciting news to bring to you in this latest episode of Spurs and what they are attempting to try and do. Before we bring in our wonderful special guest back alongside me, I'm joined by Jamie Brown over at the Daily Hotspur, who is starving. Jay, how are you? Love to be back alongside me.
I'm good. Obviously, always mixed feelings being a Spurs fan. Incredible win last night, but obviously looking at some of the transfer news that's come out today, a little bit of a dampener on the mood. But look, it was a great win for Spurs, so I'm still in a good mood. But I'm hoping that our guest is going to make it even better.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. No pressure at all with our next guest, who is everywhere right now, and we're dragging him back in to have to try and cover Tottenham. God, for him, he's lucky. He hasn't got to do this full time. He's very, very lucky in terms of Spurs. But it must feel like full time right now because we're in the middle of the January transfer window. We're joined by the superb broadcaster, journalist, TalkSport's very own, Give Me Sport's very own. Everywhere during this window, we're joined by the superb Ben Jacobs. Ben, how are you? Love to be back alongside us.
Yeah, by the way, I'm surprised that both of you and even Thomas Frank have all got identical hairstyles and good thick locks, despite the fact that Spurs are making fans pull their hair out at the moment.
Well, we did say, Ben, we thought this might be a very, very different show to what this currently is. But in the world of Tottenham, I never like the kind of second chance things because I think, as you know, football does work in crazy ways and we're never too sure, Ben, what can happen in a split second, right?
Yeah, and I think the oddity of this particular situation is that Tottenham went into the winter and even before backing Thomas Frank, despite widespread speculation. But then in the build-up to Dortmund, it very much felt like it was a matter of when, not if, he was going to go. They got a fantastic win. The fact that Dortmund were reduced to 10 men didn't influence things because they started on the front foot. They had a point to prove. They've not conceded a goal at home in the Champions League, and they're in beast mode when they play in the Champions League. And yet they go and lose at home to West Ham United. And this Jekyll and Hyde Tottenham Hotspur must be infuriating if you're a fan. The thing that I believe has worked against Thomas Frank in recent weeks is more of a dressing room feeling like it's the beginning of the end. And that's quite hard to change. But then you look at the reaction last night and the celebration from several senior players, and they were certainly hugging their manager and very much behind him. So now we're going to have to wait and see because we can't say he's safe. That's for sure. And if they go away at Burnley and lose, and then, of course, Frankfurt's tricky, and if they fail to make the top 8, suddenly you're exactly where you started once again. So it is simultaneously true that Tottenham want it to work with Thomas Frank. The ownership optically, or the leadership team, had that lunch with him that he referenced in his press conference. And that was very intentional to say, look, we want to focus on football. Dortmund is a big game. But at the same time, as all well-run clubs do, Tottenham are succession planning and working out who their candidates are because a change is still very possible. So it's a stay of execution, but it definitely doesn't mean that Thomas Frank isn't still effectively on a game-by-game or month-by-month period of review. And it is still very realistic, if that isn't a turned corner after the excellent win over Dortmund, that they still go ahead and make a change, whether now or in the summer.
I think, Ben, you've already kind of stolen our script for the first couple of questions, which is great. You've answered those for us. That's superb. I think maybe just sticking on the Frank point before I can out there, guys, as you know as well, we are out there, of course, on all our major audio platforms. You can catch us on iTunes. We're on Spotify. So like I say, you can catch the show back on audio for those that haven't got the ability to always watch it live time in YouTube. I appreciate live time. Doesn't feel like live time with Last One Spurs because I know we're always late. And Ben, let's be very clear, that's a regular feature, not when you're here, Ben. We are always late, just so you are.
You're always later with me, though. So a little story, even though it's got nothing to do with Tottenham, just because we kind of joke that it's always Ricky's fault, but virtually every show we're late is my fault. First of all, there was Champions League, and I was stupid to think I would be here 10 on the dot. Then I was about ready, and I didn't have my charger. Then I went and got this can of Coke, and then just before we went on air, I got 2 bits of news. One that I've broken, which is to do with Bournemouth. So nobody cares on this stream. But another bit of Spurs news that I'll give you a little bit later on this podcast. And I don't think the little bit of news, even though it's not an out-and-out transfer, it's just a piece of the puzzle to tease it, but I don't think that bit of information is out there yet. So stay tuned.
Ben, thank you so much. Guys out there, if you can, for us, like, hype, subscribe to the show. That would be greatly appreciated. Like I say, Ben, you've kind of clarified the situation around Frank, that it is a pretty much game-by-game situation at the moment. I know, like I say, I think me and Jamie are keen to ask you about maybe future planning. But before we do, I mean, when we talk about Tottenham pre-planning, it feels like we haven't really been pre-planning as such on anything so far during this window. Because if I just tell listeners and audio that aren't aware already, we are hearing reports currently out of Sweden that Lucas Bergval is expected to miss the next 2 to 3 months through injury. So in terms of what has happened since the transfer window has opened for Tottenham, we've sold Brennan Johnson, Mohamed Kudus is out for 3 months, Richarlison's out for 3 months, Bentancur's out for 3 months. Being reported at the moment, I say in Swedish media, Lucas Bergval's out for 3 months, and Ben Davies, as things stand, we expect is going to be ruled out for the season. So it feels at the moment, Ben, that there's a lot of work to do. And is it fair to say that this last week or so, which has been dominated by the future of Thomas Frank, has that just been a massive distraction for Tottenham's failure so far in terms of this transfer window? Because yes, they have brought Conor Gallagher in, Brennan Johnson's gone out. So technically at the moment, all we've done is balance the books.
Yeah. And when your manager is under scrutiny, any player that you try and get in the market is going to say, will the manager stay? Will the system remain the same? Paratici's on the way out to Fiorentina as well. So who is going to be leading the sporting department? I know that Johan Langer's still there, obviously, but there'll be question marks, particularly, I think, for several players in Central Europe where Paratici was the main guy. That was his stomping ground, even when Levy was at the club. So as a consequence, if you add that to the fact that Daniel Levy was so hands-on at the football club, there's now a market confusion, perhaps, as to who's running the show at Tottenham. And this is kind of normal when ownership changes, but that hasn't quite happened at Tottenham. They've sort of just revamped their leadership team. So it's difficult mid-season, even if they get to the knockout stage of the Champions League, which is appealing and with a wonderful training facility, great fan base and massive stadium. It's quite hard because Thomas Frank has been heavily invested in both the bits of business. So Sousa's done his medical. So as long as the visa comes through, that's all fine. And Frank held a direct conversation with the player. And even more so with Conor Gallagher, Frank called him up and he was a driving force behind it. Haitinger comes in as an assistant. And I think Tottenham optically, again, made a very clear point of showing Haitinger and Frank when they announced that news. So he's been hands-on. And this is why, to use Frank's words, he feels that he's got the, quote, trust of the football club, because his argument is, why would the leadership have a lunch with him if there was a situation where they were about to get rid of him? And that's kind of where Frank's head is at the moment. But the market will necessarily have to consider a change, which might include system, different manager, and the fact that Tottenham are by no means guaranteed to get Champions League football next season. And you add all of that up, and it's a situation where it's very difficult for them to move in what always is a seller's market anyway. Then add the injuries that you've mentioned, and they suddenly have urgency, which means if they want certain players in the 11th hour of the January and early February window, they have to pay above the odds as well. So this is a really key juncture for this new look Spurs leadership team, inclusive of all the younger members of the Lewis family. Nick Bosher in particular, I'm told, is playing a very driving role and is quite hands-on and visible, and Vinay, who you see there as well. And they're going to have to decide not just whether they're going to back Frank, but whether they're effectively going to do something Daniel Levy rarely did, which is overpay midway through the season because they have urgency. And if Frank was succeeding, they would still have to do that because, as you say, they're very thin at the moment. And the aim will naturally be to make the knockout stage of the Champions League and qualify for some kind of European football. So it's going to be fascinating, because if this ambition is really there, even though I totally appreciate, and for balanced journalism, we should point it out, not all the perfect targets are available right now. But if this ambition is there, this desire to change the foundation of the club, with or without Thomas Frank, that part shouldn't matter. They've got to go and do something in the market to show the market they're stable, to show the market they've got a direction of travel and a strategy once Paratici leaves and after Daniel Levy's gone. And in a weird way, even though it would be disruptive, of course, it probably doesn't matter whether Thomas Frank stays or goes, because Tottenham have to have that leadership clarity and that ambition, football and financial. And if they don't, even though it is difficult in this winter market, then there's a danger in the Premier League, at least, that they end up exactly where they were 12 months ago.
Just to bring it back quickly to Heitinga, the newly appointed assistant coach. Now, we said it's maybe a good time for Thomas Frank in terms of backing him, but obviously he's just come out of a job at, a main managerial job at Ajax, so he's shown that he's got like the capacity to be a manager. Do you think that might be then potentially future planning in terms of getting an interim in? Should that be a concern for Frank at all?
I don't think it's sort of Trojan horse scenario where they've brought him in knowing that he'll take a couple of games. But yeah, if they need something temporary, they can go down that route. They could back Frank for a little bit longer, because maybe some of the candidates they're thinking about are more inclined to take a job during the summer or only available in the summer. And that's the kind of fascinating conundrum that they've got. Is it more disruptive to make a mid-season change if you're not going to have a permanent manager? Not every club's like Man United, where your caretaker options are legends of the club and often have taken charge before. Solskjaer would have been a decent option. So would Ruud van Nistelrooy. Michael Carrick gets the job. That's three acceptable enough options to say we're going to wait until the summer when loads of candidates are available. Tottenham and interims have never really had longevity or worked. And historically, under Daniel Levy, they didn't really make that many changes mid-season. It's only one or two, maybe maximum, that I can think of off the top of my head. So this isn't a very Spurs-like approach to cut loose of a still relatively new manager that they backed and make a mid-season change. But the difference is obviously Daniel Levy and Paratici were driving that recruitment process. So now the newer members of the Lewis family in particular can say, we want to do something different, and we are going to have the ambition to do it right away. But then if they can't back that up with the right long-term name, they're going to be stuck with an interim again. And that's some kind of challenge for a new developing leadership team, of which senior members haven't really been involved in the day-to-day of Tottenham before, even if they've been at the club for quite some time. So it's a really complex situation. But I come back to what I said before. I still sense that Thomas Frank's job is at serious risk, even though Tottenham will want to quell the noise, point to the Dortmund win and say he's turned a corner.
You mentioned quite an interesting point there. Now, James had come on and ask you about potentially future-proofing what they are going to look to maybe towards the summer. But you mentioned about the camp there, Ben, and about the players. I know it was reported only a week or so ago around the fact there's been a lot of player dissatisfaction in the camp. And I think we were mentioning the point, certainly on here in the last week or so, that you can just sense that dissent has been growing under Thomas Frank, where in comparison to Ange Postecoglou, despite at times, look, there had been, a number of bad results, negative periods during his tenureship. It felt during Ange's tenure, very much the players were still with him and there wasn't that element to it. Would that be one of the biggest concerns, like you've said earlier, the fact that it feels in terms of that dressing room, do you believe there's some splits in there where there are certain players that are not believing in maybe the way Thomas Frank would like the team to play? And similar to the way, of course, that we heard Mickey van der Ven, suggest this in the overlap interview with regards to Ange, that they consulted Ange and said, look, we've got to change things here in terms of the way we're playing. Do you sense that is the case inside that Tottenham camp at the moment with regards to Frank and the way the team is maybe being asked to play? Because I think what's quite interesting is that that first half display that we saw against Dortmund, it felt to some degree that the shackles had been lifted.
Yeah, I think watching Tottenham this season, and I don't mean this as any disrespect to Brentford, but it feels like Frank's come in and he's played with the same approach as in his old job, and Tottenham crave and expect, even though Brentford better than Tottenham last season, a more aggressive front foot kind of football that's maybe less of a game of chess, less fluidly tactical. and more dominant, using width, using pace, having a focal point up front, and creative players with energy and pace and progressive passes that fans can get behind in the centre of the park. Now, Frank may argue he's setting up this way because he doesn't have all the tools that are necessary, but Tottenham fans want to see a Spurs side, not just that wins, but has that kind of right approach, which is why ultimately Mauricio Pochettino was very popular at the football club. And I do think there has been some question marks from senior players about Thomas Frank. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's toxic and the players have turned against their manager. But big egos, top names, captains and leaders at football clubs, they tend to sense when a manager is on his or her last legs. And then when that happens, they go into a bit of autopilot and they double down on their position because they know that a change is coming. And I think that's about as far as we can say, that senior players, to my understanding, have sensed a turning of the tide, a change is coming. And Dortmund kind of went against the grain. And I've absolutely no doubt if they'd have lost to Dortmund, that this show would all be about Thomas Frank has gone or Thomas Frank is going, and that's still potentially the direction of travel, but he's got a stay of execution. And you look at the players' reaction to celebrating the goals and several of them running over to Thomas Frank, and you definitely can see that they've not all turned against him, and they must have an acceptance and acknowledgement that they've not also performed at their best. And if you look at that West Ham game, which was dreadful, you're home, it's just a 4-2-3-1. It's not a difficult formation to grasp. You're playing against a West Ham side that are short on confidence. You've got a front two at West Ham in Pablo behind the striker Castellanos that are completely brand new. So stop Bowen, stop Summerville, and find width and stretch West Ham and dominate possession and be aggressive, and you win that game. Because to be honest with you, Conor Gallagher, Xavi Simons and Archie Gray should have been able to bulldoze Souček, Fernandez and Pablo and be interchangeable and to drag the defenders out of position and then put balls into the box to Kolo Muani. But for whatever reason, they were defeatist. And they line up at home sometimes, particularly against sides that play a lower block and are more defensive, almost like they're an away team and they're trying to get through the first 20 minutes and they don't want to concede a first half goal. And then if they fall behind, you kind of see them wake up and you think, where was that roar and that push in the first 10 minutes to override a team and make the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium more of a fortress? And I think that is down to culture, and some of the players perhaps feel that Frank is not leading on that. But let's see what happens, because he looked like a dead man walking heading into Dortmund, and now he's likely, if not definitely, because he's up for the media duties, going to get the Burnley game. If he wins that, I don't think you can suddenly sack him, because then he can point to 2 wins on the bounce. And the last thing Tottenham would want to do is make a change before a massive game away at Frankfurt. You win that or get something from that and qualify automatically for the last 8. And it puts a very different complexion on the midway point of the season.
Yeah, well, whatever Frank's going to be saying, we're going to start talking about some potential replacements that could be getting lined up. A very popular name, already a name that you have mentioned, Ben, and I'm sure it's one that you've already reported as well. Mauricio Pochettino, of course, he is in a job at the moment. The United States national team, he's going to be taking them to a home World Cup this summer. Is that sort of a name that Spurs can, going to be linked with? And is that one that we're really going to be waiting until the summer, given his commitments with them?
Oh, yeah. Mauricio Pochettino is impossible to get mid-season. He's not going to leave the US men's national team before the World Cup. After the World Cup, the expectation is he leaves. So like Thomas Tuchel, this is a role that he's taken for a home World Cup. Thereafter, I'm told Pochettino wants to come back to the Premier League and would be open to Spurs. And absolutely, if they make a change, he'll be a candidate, which means that they might have to put an interim in place. Other names that I'm hearing that are likely to be in the frame, Roberto De Zerbi again. I don't think he'll take it, but before Thomas Frank was approached, Tottenham went formally to De Zerbi as well, and they tried to get him back to the Premier League. One day, De Zerbi will end up back in the Premier League, but it wouldn't remotely surprise me if that's at one of the 2 Manchester clubs, because he's a candidate for Man United, and some say that he'll be in the frame for Manchester City if Pep Guardiola goes as well. So I'm not sure anything will develop there. Interestingly, Andoni Iraola was someone Daniel Levy put forwards on the shortlist, but there's no indication yet that now Tottenham are thinking as much about Iraola. A lot of noise about Glasner. We'll have to wait and see. That could be a possibility mid-season, even though there was a clear the air meeting between Glasner and Crystal Palace. But at this stage, Tottenham haven't reached out to Glasner, and yet they have made some informal approaches just to sound out a few other names, and Pochettino is one of them. So that shows you that they're working on succession planning, but likely not at this stage going to managers, your Glasners, your Iraolas, your Silvers that are in jobs, because you kind of can only make that approach if you definitively have a vacancy, whereas it's easier to speak to an international manager or a free agent. Xavi Hernandez, I know, has been linked. All I can tell you at this stage is Xavi Hernandez would take a Premier League job in a heartbeat. Manchester United is another one that he'd like on his radar, but they're going to go for a manager with proven Premier League experience. Xabi Alonso in the middle there is a free agent. People are wrongly adding up 2 and 2 and making 5 and assuming that he's nailed on for Liverpool. Absolutely, if there's a Liverpool vacancy and Alonso's a free agency, he's going to be one of the names in their thinking. But for now, anyway, Slot retains the backing of the Liverpool board. So this isn't a case of having their head turned at this stage by Alonso. And I'm told there's only so long that Alonso's going to wait because he wants to dive straight back in. I think that in the case of Xavi Alonso, his reputation hasn't really been damaged in any way by what happened at Real Madrid. So he'll be massively in demand, and he does have aspirations to manage in the Premier League. So the better Slot does, and if Tottenham have a vacancy, maybe there will be a situation where he becomes a candidate. And I know there is some appreciation from within the Tottenham hierarchy for Xabi Alonso. Few people asking me about Enzo Maresca as well. Of course, he's a free agent. I don't think because of the manner in which he left Chelsea, anything would really stop him wanting to go to Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. But he also hasn't had a call or an approach at this stage. And it's Man City, if Pep Guardiola leaves, along with Roberto De Zerbi, that several people in the industry feel will be the club for either Maresca or De Zerbi, with no decision made yet, because we don't know whether Guardiola is going to go this summer or in a year's time. So the good news for Tottenham, if they make a change, is that there's several candidates out there. And it wouldn't surprise me if they end up waiting for Maurizio Pochettino. Bad news for Tottenham if they make a change, as it means the season's not going according to track. So this is the challenge. This is the debate, when to do it. If it's the beginning of the end for Frank, can they find the right kind of replacement? But don't rule out Pochettino being a high name in Tottenham's thinking if they make a change, and don't rule out Tottenham deciding to go for somebody else because they have to wait for Pochettino. There could be a scenario, if Pochettino agrees to the role and they make a change, where Tottenham, a bit like Man United, put somebody in until the end of the season, or stick with Frank until the end of the season, and then, like Postecoglou, make a genuine assessment at the end of the season, where they might, with more data, stick with Frank at that point, or they might get rid of him knowing that there's a smoother transition to bring in a new manager because there's more of these candidates available in the summer compared to now.
I'm about to ask you, Ben, how much of a distraction this has been with regards to this managerial chat that we've had in the last 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so, and how much this has disrupted Tottenham's window. But I'm going to be an absolute utter hypocrite and ask you to go back to Pochettino for a second and just get your understanding of it, because I know you interviewed him not too long ago, in which I think he told you in that interview he expressed his wish to come back and manage in the Premier League. What I'd love to know from you is, how would you see that working in terms of the fact that because the World Cup does go deep into next summer, how much would that impact him taking a Premier League job, given the fact you'd have to pre-plan pre-season? As we know, clubs go on tour quite early into the, I think, June, July period. How much would that impact Pochettino in the fact that if he's at a World Cup and the US do get to some degree past the first stages, how much do you think that has a real impact in terms of taking a Premier League job?
Not massively, because if it's the beginning of the end for Thomas Frank and they chose to line up Pochettino, an international manager also has more time between now and the end of the season before they come in to do an element of informal work or planning or whatever you want to call it. And in addition to that, from Tottenham's point of view, several of their players will be at the World Cup as well and may go further than the US men's national team. So pre-season, the early part that would overlap with the World Cup, is always kind of weird because it tends to be your squad players and your younger players if you're a big six club like Tottenham. And as a consequence, I don't think that that would be the deal breaker between going in that direction with Pochettino versus another name. If they think Pochettino is the right name, they'll know he's got the affinity with the fan base. They'll know the style that they're getting. They'll be well aware that he's kept his place in London. So the transition, should they go down that route, would be relatively easy, regardless of the fact that absolutely he'd have to focus on the US men's national team and then take the job. But as I said before, several of Tottenham's senior players will go to the World Cup and will be late themselves back to pre-season. So it's not ideal compared to being able to bring someone in day one after the season ends. Yet if they were to get rid of Thomas Frank, and now it is an if, despite the fact that he's under serious threat still, should they bring in a caretaker, that caretaker can still take the first part of pre-season or liaise with Mauricio Pochettino in the months before the World Cup. Then he goes out of reach and focuses solely on the US men's national team. As soon as the World Cup ends, he comes back in, no concern at all. So if they want Pochettino, they'll go for Pochettino regardless of the World Cup. But there will be other candidates. Like I say, Roberto De Zerbi, I think, will end up back somewhere in the Premier League. Thomas Tuchel will likely not extend with England and end back somewhere in the Premier League. And then the likes of Enzo Maresca, Xavi Alonso, Marco Silva, Andoni Iraola, Oliver Glasner. These are all managers that could be on the move. So you're really not short of options. I'm not saying they're all going to be on the Tottenham list, but if they were to make a change and choose to wait until the summer, they'll be sport for choice.
Ben, thank you so much. That has brought us firmly up to date in terms of the manager situation at Spurs. Ironic, isn't it? We're here for a transfer window update and we're halfway through and we're talking about the manager. We are.
Yeah, but the whole window's been like that. I mean, New Year's Eve, ruined by Chelsea. 10 p.m, broke the exclusive that Enzo Maresca wasn't sick and was leaving Chelsea. Confirmed on the 1st. Then on the 4th, Ruben Amorim, we realised after the game against Wolves that there's a breakdown with Jason Wilcox and he was going to go within 24, 48 hours. Wilfred Nancy and Xavi Alonso pretty much went at the same time. Oliver Glasner nearly went, but announced that he was leaving. Thomas Frank nearly went, but beat Dortmund. I mean, it's absolutely wild. And you may have heard an interview from the Middle East with the former Sky presenter, Richard Keys, who alleged Pep Guardiola might walk. Now, I have no indication of that, but it just shows you how crazy this January has been. There's been almost as many, if not more, within England, managerial changes than actual transfers coming through the door.
So it's been more a managerial win than it has been a player win at the moment, Ben. Listen, we'll have to see. Listen, thank you so much for that. We're going to squeeze in our first break of the show for our listeners that are on audio. Thanks to the over 5,500 that are with us live during the show. I hope Ben won't mind us saying this because we're at a point now where I'm not sure how much longer we can promote the product because of the nature that Spurs might not be in Europe for much longer, but they are going to hopefully beat Frankfurt and qualify for the next round. We are delighted Last Word on Spurs to be sponsored by NordVPN. You can get your best discount off NordVPN, not off a NordVPN plan, by going to nordvpn.com/LWS, where you'll get 4 extra months for free on a 2-year plan, and there is no risk with Nord's 30-day money guarantee. Right, we are going to hopefully now move on to where Spurs are during this transfer window, incomings, outgoings. If guys out there, as always, you can like, hype, subscribe to the show. That would be greatly appreciated. On the back of all that, Ben, the first thing I'm going to ask you, as we're now going to try and accelerate our way through where we are with Tottenham in general, how much has this been a distraction for Spurs in terms of the manager in relation to what Spurs are trying to get done this window? I asked you at the top, I told you at the top of the show, of course, the one player coming in so far in Conor Gallagher, Brennan Johnson, the one going out. So technically Tottenham balanced the books, but it's in a window where Tottenham urgently, you feel, need reinforcements. And that was before the latest plethora of players that have gone down injured. So how much of a distraction has this been and delayed Spurs' window so far, given the nature of this managerial situation around Thomas Frank right now?
Yeah, Frank, like I said before, was involved in Sousa and involved heavily in Conor Gallagher. So in some ways, not a distraction. The injuries have changed their approach, though. And I think the exit of Brennan Johnson was obviously very unfortunate and not that popular, I think, with the fan base. And then Mohamed Kudus gets injured and you think, why on earth did you sanction that move? But also, and as importantly, go and spend that money. Tottenham may argue they spent it on Conor Gallagher, but with Champions League football, there's more money to spend as well. So right now, I think the bigger distraction than Thomas Frank, because he'll continue to be involved in recruitment as long as he's at the football club. And he's very good, by the way, at pitching to players and convincing them, because he tends to prepare with data and have a real pitch for the pathway of the player, even if they're senior and they have pre-expectations of the role they're going to play. Frank tends to come to pitches with a few surprises and be really in depth and use data and present to them rather than only kind of interview them or say that he wants them. So that's a plus. The negative, I think, is just that, yes, there's a question mark over Frank, but then when Paratici is announced as going mid-window as well, and he'd spent the build-up to this winter involved in several conversations as well, it makes Tottenham look a bit rudderless because they've replaced Daniel Levy with somebody that is not hands-on day-to-day. And Vinay, when he did his interview, stressed that that was the case, that there would not be a like-for-like title and role like Daniel Levy. Paratici, then returning as a staffer, was meant to be in spite of the Levy exit and was all about continuity and sticking to a long-term plan, but he doesn't stick around for the project for very long. So it's now not entirely clear who exactly is in this pyramid going to be the kind of top dog, because Vinay, for example, would be the one leading a managerial appointment with Johan and the younger members of the Lewis family, but particularly Nick Bosher. And yet, if they felt they needed two co-sporting directors, then are they going to put the trust in Johan or bring somebody in or restructure someone? Obviously, Rafi has come in a newly created role as well. So Tottenham are atypically, and this is really quite strange, rebuilding their leadership team at the same time that we're midway through a window. And that, regardless of the Frank situation, is the thing that I'm told internally at the club is the most disruptive, because the kind of chain of command and the directions of travel in the short term are not necessarily as smooth or as clear as they might be in the summer when this new leadership team is more settled.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on the 2 points there. With Paratici, it'd be interesting to see what they do as to whether they look to replace him directly or how they're going to manage that structure. And like we said there, the fact that Rafi Mawson coming in, it'll be intriguing to see from that perspective how they are going to shape up come the summer, because I think we've seen in the last 12 months or so many changes at board level where, look, it's going to take time for them to get a grip in terms of what they need to do. But I think what's been clear for a lot of Tottenham fans out there is that there's been a need this window, especially, to strengthen. Now, I think the last time, Ben, we touched base with you on here was, around the start of the month, where we were understood to be looking for, at the time, a left winger, another midfielder, and a centre-back if one departs. Now, we obviously, of course, know, as you said there, Sousa is coming in the building. Conor Gallagher is already here. And it also has been suggested that Tottenham are also looking to upgrade in any areas they possibly can, in which technically means a variety of players can either head through the door if an opportunity arises itself. Coming in now to what the final 9-10 days of this window, what do you personally understand to be the key targets of Tottenham before the end of this window, what they would like to do in terms of incomings?
Yeah, first and foremost, they would love a starting left winger or left attacker. And it's just whether or not Akliush or Diamande or even Savinio become available. If not, I think they'll delay there and end up waiting until the summer. And the reluctance to let Mathis Tel go anywhere is partially down to the fact maybe they don't think they can get any of these names. Still another midfielder, I'm told. And part of the reason why is because as much as Conor Gallagher is viewed as perfect for Tottenham, he's not quite the profile, in fact, at all, the profile of Bentancur. And should Paulinho not have the option to buy taken up, then naturally they could do with a number 6 as well, or even like a metronome, someone that can be a ball winner, but also a progressive passer from deeper areas, because DMs these days can actually be quite creative. And Paulinho is a fascinating one because at the beginning of the season, 6 weeks or so in, it looked nailed on that Tottenham would just buy him. And it was the player, by the way, that said, I want an option to buy in this deal because I want to join this football club permanently. And he's done okay since, but I think Tottenham are still debating whether there is value on buying Paulinho permanently. They were more inclined to do it in maybe early November. Now it feels a bit more of a coin flip. So deeper lying midfielder, absolutely. Sousa's obviously come in at left back and is kind of one for the future. But with the Davis injury and the fact that Jed Spence is forced to switch sides sometimes, maybe he'll get a little bit more imminent game time. And then I think they could still do a number 9. But once again, part of it is linked to Richarlison's long-term future. And the other aspect is, once again, are the targets they're looking for available right now. We kept hearing links with Ivan Toney. And as I've said several times, and I broke a few weeks ago, Tony's not expected to go anywhere yet. There's the Thomas Frank connection, but that's about it. Al Ahly are the defending Asian Champions League champions. They don't want to let him go. He's got an astronomical wage. Few people asking me about Mateta. At the moment from the Premier League, it's Villa, and we know Juventus and Milan have tried in the past. I'm not aware of Tottenham moving, and that would be a tough one because you look at Mateta's age, you look at Richarlison's age and profile, you look at Solanke, they're all reasonably similar. And if they are to add a 9, you might find profile-wise not this player, to be clear, because he only just joined Chelsea. But if you look at João Pedro, he can play second striker. He's good against a low block. He can be a lead 9. He can even go as a wide forward as well and play in a 4-4-2 if needed. I think that's the kind of profile that they want. Someone younger and someone to, at the moment, complement Solanke and Richarlison. And in the long run, it could be replace Richarlison as well. But I don't think Mateta ticks those boxes. Could be proven wrong because when you get to the final days of the window, if you're absolutely desperate, you might go, screw the strategy, screw what we want in the summer. He's one of the only players that's available. So if it's a choice between him and 40-odd million Palace's asking price or doing nothing, and this is where teams overpay and go crazy in the final hours of the window with really unexpected deals. But at the moment, it's all quiet on the striker front. Another midfielder, left winger, seem to be 2 priorities. If Dragusin goes, they need a centre-back. Regardless of the Dragusin situation, they probably need to add a centre-back anyway, but that might come during the summer. And I know we've heard reports in the last 24, 48 hours that they're considering their number 2 goalkeeper position as well. So the short answer to your question is they're looking all over the field, but the priority was left-back cover and young and somebody in central midfield. So in fairness to the recruitment team, they have brought in 2 in more urgent positions. But if it was a perfect world, I think they would want 2 more players to come in between now and the end of the window.
Yeah, one of the players that we have been really strongly linked with and looks like it's pretty much done. I think he even announced himself before Spurs even had the chance to do so. I think he was in attendance at the game against West Ham, which I'm sure he's kind of looking into flights back to Brazil as we speak. But Sousa, where are we at with that deal? Because as we said, as you know, it looks like it's all pretty much agreed. £13 million fee for him. Talk of like paperwork still being done. Is this a deal that you expect to get done? And how close do we think it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's all done in terms of medical and the agreement, as you say, about 13 million. But you got to get the visa. And that would usually be a formality. But of course, it can be a bit more complicated or time consuming when you're dealing with South American players and young footballers. So Tottenham are calm about the situation, but the deal is basically all going to get done. He's already made the journey over to complete formalities at his end, but it's pending the visa and then it will be formalized. So obviously we're expecting this one, if there aren't any surprises, to get over the line. And the backstory here is very interesting. So the first thing to point out is when this transfer first came about, the release clause that the player had was kind of protected, and Santos were playing games. So on the last show when I came on, because this is what was being hinted by sources from Brazil, I spoke about 100 million euros release clause, and therefore Tottenham's offer nowhere near the release clause. They were going to have to up the add-ons. They were going to have to up the fixed fee. and they were going to have to get not at the release clause, but 2-3 times higher than their original offer, which was in the region of 8 million euros. In the end, they didn't have to go that much higher. And that's because there was a game that went on. And the release clause, despite the fact it's widely out there everywhere, 100 million euros from virtually every outlet that you'll see. But my understanding is this was Santos playing a game, because when they first started the negotiations, Tottenham were not that sure about the terms of the deal. And actually, the release clause was not 100 million euros. It was 100 million Brazilian. And sometimes as a journalist, when people want to spin you a little bit, they'll very cleverly give you a number and not give you a currency. And you'll often go dollars, euros, pounds, and maybe you'll just get a number again. But if you convert 100 million Brazilian, not 100 million euros, it comes to pretty much what Tottenham have paid. So they've effectively matched the release clause, but they've not triggered it in order to get more permanent payment terms. He's agreed a 5.5-year deal, and a really, really talented prospect who, as he grows and becomes a bit more tenacious, is going to be somebody that can really bomb forward. So right now, what I like about him, having watched a lot of him at youth level, is his positional awareness is first rate. He's fast and he's excellent at stepping into space, which is really important because his anticipation, if he's inverting, for example, or even overlapping potentially, although overlapping is more just about staying with the play, inverting is about working out where the ball is going to go and then stepping into that space, whether in or out of possession. And in both aspects, but particularly inverting into space, he's excellent. And that allows him to get that little head start, which means that you'll watch him carry the ball and really get up into midfield. He's a progressive passer. He's got a decent cross on him as well. And he's relatively good when facing a one-on-one as well. So you're going to see quite a mature player who needs to build up a bit and obviously needs to get up to speed with Premier League pace. But with Davis unfortunately injured now, it wouldn't surprise me if he does get some game time between now and the end of the season. So as long as the visa goes through, he can be considered a Tottenham player.
Jay, how about you?
Yeah, no, a really interesting name that was linked this window was Curtis Jones from Liverpool.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we've already completed the signing of Conor Gallagher. So this would feel like an interesting signing if we were to bring in another English midfielder. I know they are slightly different, and a lot of Spurs fans do seem to really rate Curtis Jones and see him as maybe more of a progressive passer. Is this sort of a deal that you can see Spurs getting done? And is this one they might actually look into? Is this an interested player?
Yeah, this is definitely a player that Tottenham have on their radar. The challenge, I think, is that Liverpool don't want to do business, which is probably why nothing will come with it in the coming days. Perhaps one for the summer. But from Liverpool's perspective, they're quite thin on the ground at the moment. I know he's not identical in any way, shape or form to Harvey Elliott, but ultimately Liverpool still feel that in Jones, they've got somebody versatile that can play in a number of different positions. And as a consequence, I think it's going to be very difficult for Tottenham to make any progress. Joe Gomez was the other one, of course, that Tottenham looked at too. And it's a similar story. Why would Liverpool let a player like that go until they get to the summer potentially and Giovanni Leone can come back? And also they can go in the market and buy another defender too. So anyone coming to Liverpool, unfortunately, if they want a Liverpool player in the final days of the window, are probably going to be told that Liverpool might not add and Liverpool might not subtract. So I think this is one to revisit in the summer, but I'd be really, really surprised if Liverpool sanctioned anything in the last 10 days or so of the window.
Mm-hmm. Another Premier League player that was linked was Cresensio Somerville from West Ham. Now, Spurs fans will obviously know him very well from the weekend. That's because he got his first Premier League goal of the season. And of course, it was against us. But yeah, obviously a name that's been linked with Spurs today. Well, it was yourself that, Ben, you reported, didn't you? Reported £25 million fee. Is this sort of a deal that Spurs might look into and have any sort of chance of doing? Because we know in the summer, all the talk around Kudus and that being the first deal since, I think it was 2011, wasn't it, with Scott Parker. Spurs and West Ham going to do business again so quickly?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because Paqueta was linked, Somerville linked, Hermansen linked, and yet it's West Ham. And as you say, Tottenham very rarely do business. What I can tell you is that there's a classic element of gamesmanship going on, because Tottenham don't want to move for a West Ham player in particular unless they think they can get a West Ham player. And to get a West Ham player, you have to inquire about a West Ham player. And then if you're shot down, you're going to say, we never inquired, in the same way that Tottenham spun, they never reached an agreement with Eberechi Eze. And then subsequently it came out that they did, as I reported at the time. Tottenham tried to make out that they were not going for Dominic Solanke because they weren't sure whether they'd get it over the line. 2 days later, they signed the player. So my understanding is that even though Tottenham will deny they've done anything for Cresensio Somerville, they made an inquiry. And the answer to that inquiry was, we're not going to sell now. And that's about as far as it's got. Suggestions that a bid is being prepared are premature, and I think now this evening wide of the mark, because I don't think it's anything other than an inquiry. And as you can imagine, clubs don't like their inquiries getting out there. Clubs don't like to confirm players that they've tried for if those players don't want to join, or if the club doesn't want to sell, because it can weaken the position in the market and it can make you look very unpopular with your fan base. Why are we trying for this player? Why aren't we bidding for another player? We've put out there now that we've got 25 million to spend, so let's go and spend that 25 million on another player. So it's kind of smart by Tottenham to be like, no, we didn't try for Hermansen. No, we didn't try for Somerville. No, we're not doing business with West Ham. But I'm told the story is very different, and it's West Ham not looking to do business for Somerville now, which means if he does go, and if West Ham go down, it's going to be one to watch for the summer. But you can understand why they made an inquiry, in the same way that everyone is going to Wolves over Strand Larsen and João Gomez, because you know that you might get a deal now, because the clubs are aware if they go down, they're going to get lowballed during the summer. So you kind of have to understand, is there a middle ground in January where the price comes down a bit comparative to waiting until the summer? And then in Wolves' case anyway, if/when they go down, João Gomez might not be 45 million. Jorgen Strand Larsen might not be 40 million, in the same way that Tottenham scandalously, dare I say, took James Maddison off Leicester when my team went down, and they got him for an excellent rate as well. Everton were able to take Tyler Dibbling off Southampton for 7 to 10 million less than Saints said they wanted. And 6 months earlier, when he was being linked with Tottenham, he was a £100 million player. So this is why you make the inquiry, whether for now or whether for the summer. But officially, Tottenham are going to deny it. Tottenham are going to pretend like they never made the call. So it's kind of what narrative you want to believe, really. You can take a club source position at face value, because they're almost certainly not going to bid or sign Somerville in the last 10 days of the window, barring a ridiculous U-turn of position from West Ham United. So people can sleep easy if they don't like Somerville and just accept that they never did anything. But my info is that they did do something. They made a call and it was shut down by West Ham United.
Well, sticking on the West Ham theme, he's not been the only West Ham player that's been linked to us in this last 24 hours or so. Jamie is shaking his head furiously. I think a lot of Spurs fans...
Bear in mind, you're talking again to a Leicester fan.
Yeah, but he was quite good for you at Leicester, Ben.
He was.
I mean, since we've seen him outside of Leicester, that's another question. I'm questioning whether he's a goalkeeper. No offence to the man out there. There's been suggestions in this last 24, 48 hours, Ben, that there's been potential negotiations between Tottenham and West Ham United over a potential swap deal involving Tottenham's, at this moment, backup goalkeeper in Antonin Kinski, with Spurs looking at the West Ham United backup goalkeeper, Mads Hermansen. So they'd be effectively, if you look at it like this, swapping benches. Now, we'll come on to Vicario, who I think, again, there's no guarantee what his future looks like, but you'd presume the base of this agreement is that if it was to go ahead, and Kinski will take on it now, is that Kinski goes as number one at West Ham and he starts in the Premier League, and Hermansen sits on our bench, and I don't say any disrespect, in the hope that he doesn't need to be used, because you've watched him in the Premier League, I think, a couple of times this season, and he was dropped by West Ham. But you could argue as well, because friend of the show, John over at the White Rose, has spoken to us about him, that he may be very well known to Thomas Frank, therefore, for his time at Denmark and Brøndby. And there are reports that he rates Hermansen, which, if anything, gives me more concern around Thomas Frank, to be honest with you, that he might rate this goalkeeper. Can you bring us up to speed, Ben? Is this a genuine potential swap you can see happening between the two clubs?
So again, Tottenham sources say no, and the perspective of Spurs is, why would they go out in the market and switch a number 2 goalkeeper for a number 2 goalkeeper, and why would either goalkeeper want to move to go from one bench to another bench? Now, granted, if Hermansen is told by Thomas Frank, you'll come in and you'll play your way to be the number 1 at the football club, that's a different story. And it's worth pointing out that West Ham are perfectly fine sanctioning a Hermansen exit because it hasn't worked. And they have had an absolute disaster class with goalkeepers, where it looked like they were going to sign John Victor. They moved on to Hermansen. Turned out that Graham Potter didn't like him. Suddenly he gets demoted. They go back about 3 weeks later to sign John Victor. And John Victor's like, why would, when you come crawling back, I suddenly go, yeah, now I'll come in because you signed someone else ahead of me. Then you've got the experience of Lucas Fabianski, but he's not been the starting goalkeeper. And suddenly Alphonse Areola's come in, and I actually think has done really well for West Ham United from the last few games that I've covered of them. But West Ham are looking for a number 1 goalkeeper. And if they get a number 1 goalkeeper, Areola will be the number 2. Fabianski's happy to stay at the football club, and Hermansen has to go. And it's a really weird situation with all the potential Danish number 1s, because Kasper Schmeichel is the veteran. They've got a World Cup qualifier, of course, but in the games that they wobbled in, including that defeat to Scotland, and I think the other one was Belarus, Kasper Schmeichel came under all manner of criticism, and his spot as number 1 for Denmark has a question mark over it if they qualify for the World Cup. So then you think, okay, who's it going to be? Mads Hermansen, and he's not playing, but he would have thought the move to West Ham would have given him a great opportunity of claiming that spot. And Philip Jorgensen, who's the number 2 at Chelsea. So all the Danish goalkeepers, or the young 2, Jorgensen and Hermansen, they want to go and play somewhere, which is why I kind of think, unless this is actually about Tottenham making Mads Hermansen their number 1, which would almost be an indication that Thomas Frank is running the show and is definitively staying forever and ever, then I can't see how there's any logic in this one. So a bit like Summerville, it's normal that players can be offered. It's normal that you might make an inquiry, but Tottenham's position as of this evening is it makes 0 sense to sign Hermansen, and West Ham's position is it makes 0 sense to bring in Kinski, because West Ham don't see Kinski having asked them today as number 1. And if they're going to bring in a new goalkeeper, they want a 1, not another 2. Otherwise, what's the point? Because you've got Hermansen, who is your 2, you've got Lucas Fabianski, and you've got Alphonse Areola. I mean, when they started the season, based on the targets they were looking at, Fabianski and Areola were only at best going to be their number 2. And then Hermansen fell to the number 2. So you could kind of argue they've already got 3 number 2s. So what logic on God's given earth would it suit West Ham to sign Kinski to their bench? So this feels like a really baffling one to me. And again, I'm not saying a conversation didn't take place, because the ex-West Ham employee account that broke it is extremely reliable and very close to West Ham. Huge respect. And I've got to be honest, when it's a West Ham name, they're very rarely wrong. But the Tottenham position is to deny that they have an interest in Mads Hermansen.
I think I'm trying to get to a point where I'm denying I'm a Tottenham fan at this rate. I just what is going on with our recruitment?
That's a tough one, isn't it? That Mads Hermansen. It's just bizarre, because at the start of the season, he was ridiculed for being such a poor goalkeeper, and as you pointed out, Ben, he's not even a first choice for West Ham. I'm not really sure he's third choice at the moment. So yeah, that was why me and Ricky couldn't trying to contain ourselves, because that's just a difficult.
In defence of Mads Hermansen, and we've not seen any of it at West Ham under Enzo Maresca. albeit in the Championship. He was excellent, brilliant with his feet, quick learner, strong distribution, calm, good puncher and catcher of the ball, vocal. And he looked like a serious goalkeeper, to the point where when Maresca first joined Chelsea, the signs were pointing not towards the Kiernan Dewsbury Hall signing, but Maresca raiding Leicester for Mads Hermansen. So I don't know whether it's just West Ham's system or he got off on the wrong foot and it shook his confidence a little bit, and goalkeepers can be like that. But even if I'm slightly biased as a Leicester fan, he's 25, he's peak age, he's not the tallest, he's quick, he's a decent shot stopper, and he's vocal. But at the moment, he's error prone and shook in confidence, and he's not playing like a number one. So I actually hope he can go somewhere, be a number one, and really have a strong end to the season, because then he could end up being Denmark's number one goalkeeper if they go to the World Cup. But I just don't think it's the right fit. Only a personal opinion for Tottenham.
It just feels like a David Brent moment. You still think about the bad news? we're going to go for our final break of the show for our listeners and audio. Please don't break out there, literally, if you are a Spurs fan. We're going to bring you on as to where we are in terms of targets going into this final piece of the window. We're joined by Jeremy Brown at the Daily Hotspur. We're joined by the superb Ben Jacobs, broadcaster, journalist, quite frankly, everywhere right now in this transfer window. Guys out there, thanks to their over 6,500 for persisting with us, despite Spurs trying to absolutely tear down this window literally in front of us. If you can, for us out there, guys, as always, like, hype, subscribe to the show. That would be greatly appreciated. We're going to try and return to some normality, Ben, but I'm sure you'll bring us back down to earth quickly as possible, like you've done quite often so far on these transfer shows that we've had you on. I know the last time we had you on, you did shut this one down. You said, can't see him moving, but there has been a re-emergence of links to Omar Marmush in the closing stages of this transfer window. He has fallen down the City pecking order. He's reportedly frustrated with lack of game time, indicating that it could still be open to a move that could rejuvenate his career ahead of the World Cup. I hope you won't mind me asking you again, Ben, is your understanding the same as what it was before, that you still can't see Omar Marmush leaving City in these final, 10, 11 days of this transfer window?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. City's perspective is they still want to keep Marmush, and I still feel that were Tottenham to do anything, they would try for Savinho if they were going to throw serious money at Manchester City. It's going to take something astronomical if Marmush leaves in this window. City have Ryan Cherky now kind of playing behind Erling Haaland and Phil Foden scoring, and obviously Antoine Semenyo joining in a wider area. So maybe there's a window of opportunity for somebody to make a play at Omar Marmush, but I'm still told that City see one major outgoing in the final days of the window, and that's Oscar Bob. It's not as likely Savinho will go. And obviously with Omar Marmush, we've heard from City sources throughout the majority of the window that they prefer him to stay. So it would take some serious money to change the direction of travel with Omar Marmush in the final days of the window. And as I say, if Tottenham wanted to give that money to Manchester City, I think they may feel it's better served to make a play on Savinho, who's another player that City are adamant they're not going to sanction mid-season. But the difference is that there's no price for Marmush at the moment. We'll have to wait and see whether that changes and if Tottenham actually formalise any reported interest, because we can only really call it early stage or internal at this point in time, and time is ticking away in the window. But with Savinho, the thing people don't always understand is that the money was fine. So even though Tottenham didn't sign the player over the summer, the money that they were prepared to pay didn't have to keep going up and up and up as people had suggested. Tottenham basically went to City and made an acceptable financial offer of between 65 and 70 million pounds, depending on sources you speak to and if we're including the add-ons. And Ferran Soriano, not Pep Guardiola, blocked the move, because at that point in time, City thought Savinho is going to go, join Tottenham or whoever, and be just like Cole Palmer. And we're going to watch a whole season of Savinho setting the world alight, and we're going to regret the fact that we let him go. Now with Palmer, he had to ask 3 times over 18 months before Pep Guardiola said, I won't stand in your way. Savinho was sold on a move to Tottenham. Tottenham were fine with the finances. And if Savinho had really pushed to Guardiola, maybe even Pep would have said, if the board sanction it, of course, I won't stand in your way. But Ferran Soriano in particular blocked that move. So if now, because of Semenya or because of Foden scoring goals or because of Cherki, they change their mind, Tottenham could be back again. And if not, it's looking likely that it will be Akliouche or alternatively Yan Diomande. And it still would not surprise me if Spurs try something audacious in these final days of the window over on that left-hand side. Akliouche seems to be the one that is the most feasible. Diomande feels like a mad race for the summer rather than now. And obviously, Savinho, it'll all just depend on the Man City board because the nuts and bolts of a deal from the summer are already in place. So actually, if City change their mind on Savinho, Tottenham could complete that one quite fast.
Forgive me, Ben. Is he still injured, Savinho, at the moment? Is he still injured?
And that's the other thing in all of this.
Yeah. It wouldn't be like Tottenham to sign an injured player, given they've got about 6 out at the moment at this point in the season. Jamie, I am back to you if we can.
Yeah.
If we want to.
Just also, like, one thing that's worth kind of pointing out in all of this is that Frank is basically all about 2-for-1s, right? So you look at the firm desire to strengthen on the left-hand side, and naturally, if you were being really rigid, you'd go Savinho is a good fit and Yan Diomande is quite versatile. If you go for Akliouche, the advantage is that you're filling the void left by the injured Kudus on the right-hand side, but he's capable of switching sides if needed to the left, even though he's not as strong at the moment. And people I speak to that know him well, and he's with the same agency, by the way, as Victor Gyökeres, they're adamant that, like Noni Madueke going to Arsenal, who was rigidly pinned as a right winger, but Mikel Arteta sees him as right and left. And Akliouche is the same, that first and foremost, you get cover for Kudus. Second of all, you can use him as an attacking midfielder, but he can switch sides. We've not seen that much of it, but that's where, if they go down that route, they'll feel they can cover 3 positions in one.
Do you think with Akliouche, is he a player that Monaco will let go this month? I mean, obviously, he's very highly rated there. Is that a deal that is going to be feasible at all?
I think they've got a decision to make, because whether now or in the summer, he's basically got under 3 years left on his contract. So Monaco historically have always been and will always be, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, it's just their model, a selling club. They're not quite the same as Red Bull, but Monaco and sales go hand in hand. And there's been several famous Monaco sales. So you can always get a Monaco player out. Sometimes, of course, you have to overpay. But if you think about Mbappe, the most famous sale in the club's history, but James Rodriguez, Bernardo Silva, let's not forget, and Tchouaméni, and I think even Benjamin Mendy from memory too. So you can get players out of Monaco. And when a player is not likely to extend at Monaco heading into the final 2 years of their contract, it's the sweet spot sometimes to make an offer and get relative value for money. So I still think to sign Akliouche, you're looking at in excess of 50 million euros, and maybe Monaco would even argue 60, 65 million euros, but it's not quite the same price as Diomande. It's not quite the same price as Savinho. And were they to go down that route now and say, well, he's not a predominant left winger, but he can play there, but we don't need a predominant left winger for now if we're going to keep Mathis Tel, for example. So you stick him on the right whilst Kudus is injured. And then one, you give yourself in the summer the opportunity to sign a specialist left winger. And two, you're left with a player in Akliouche that doesn't conflict with some of the other names, because you can use them on the right and also in the central area as a 10, or even pushing a bit further forwards as a second striker. So if they can't get Diomande or Savinho and they're looking for something for the now on the right and for the future more versatile, that profile might actually work.
Ben, we've come to that point in the show where I know we teed up the audience earlier. I mean, given the way the show has gone so far, everyone needs some good news. I'm not sure if this is going to be perceived anywhere near as good. I don't think it's good at all. But there has been obviously reports in this last 24 hours around the future of Tottenham Hotspur defender Mickey van der Ven, and the case that Liverpool are reportedly interested in him. Now, there's been a lot of suggestions that they're looking for a defender who can take the baton from Virgil van Dijk. There's also been suggestions that Real Madrid are also keeping tabs on the player. Whilst there were reports, it's fair to say, at the back end of the year that Spurs were reportedly looking to offer Van de Ven a new contract. That seems to have gone very, very quiet. And I think if those have been watching Van de Ven closely over the last few Spurs games, I mean, he looks about as checked out as we do as fans at the moment. Can you bring us up to date on what you understand the latest to be on Mickey Van de Ven and his future at the football club?
Yeah, so Mickey Van de Ven now going nowhere, and Tottenham have a valuation on Van de Ven at British transfer record levels. So were he to depart Tottenham, regardless of contract ticking down window upon window, Spurs would be expecting a British transfer record. And the contract of Mickey Van de Ven at the moment expires in 2028. So as he heads into the final 2 years, that number will seem higher and higher and higher comparative to how much time is left on the contract. But that is Tottenham's valuation. And I don't expect that to change in the final 11 days of the window. And it may well not change in the summer as well. So Spurs are really calm about the situation. Obviously, Liverpool are going to have to draw up a list of new centre-back targets because they were anticipating being in the mix for Mark Gahey to be the eventual heir to Virgil van Dijk, but they chose not to move mid-season. So let's see now whether they come in for Van de Ven. If they do, and I don't mean this in a negative way to Spurs, but Van de Ven is interested because Van de Ven has got an affinity with Liverpool. That's no secret. It's out there. And if Van de Ven moves, he's very likely to want to stay within the Premier League as well. But there's so many steps before we can say Liverpool are even interested. It's a really neat link to make, but Liverpool haven't made an approach as of today. But we know, like I said before, that they're drawing up a list of summer centre-back targets. The Van de Ven side are quite content to wait and focus on Spurs until the summer. And if Tottenham get Champions League football, then Van de Ven is invested in the project and would be prepared to sit down and potentially discuss an extension. So this is kind of about the Tottenham project and the Tottenham team on the field matching Van de Ven's expectations. And if they do, then all the outside noise won't necessarily matter. But if they don't, if they finish 17th in the Premier League and don't get out of the league phase of the Champions League, even though they're in a very strong position, and then they get to the summer and they've made a managerial change and he's got 2 years left on his contract, then I'm told Van de Ven will not rush into signing an extension. Yeah. And then, of course, suitors with 2 years left will see whether that British transfer record type valuation diminishes in any way as time ticks away. So this isn't really a now saga, and we can't speak of Liverpool being in talks with Van de Ven because they don't really have a formulated shortlist yet due to the fact that they were kind of waiting to see what would happen with Mark Gahey first. So for now, it's calm, but Van de Ven has to be a driving force along with the rest of the Spurs team to trying to get Champions League football and going far in the Champions League, because if the project doesn't match Van de Ven's ambition, regardless of Tottenham's high valuation, then I do think the player will be open to opportunities.
Just out of interest, Ben, there was those reports at the later part of last year that there was suggestions that Van de Ven was going to be meeting with Spurs officials to discuss a new contract. Do you know if there was ever any contract talks that ever opened over an extension to the deal?
Well, I think they've been speaking to Van de Ven for quite a while, and they've definitely indicated to his camp that they would like to extend him, but they're not in formal talks at the moment, and it would be the wrong timing, because why would a player or even Tottenham do it midway through the window with a question mark over the manager, with a departure of 50% of your sporting director team, and then Daniel Levy going over the summer as well? So stability will have to come first on and off the football field. And then, of course, Tottenham are going to take steps to see whether Mickey Van de Ven has an appetite to extend. But Van de Ven is going to take a leaf out of Van Dijk's book, Konate's book, Salah's book, and wait to see evidence that this project matches his own ambition and hopefully form as well. And if it does, then I do think they'll have formal talks, and we can't rule out an extension. But if we get to that 2 years left of the contract, and I know I've seen in the chat some people saying, isn't it 2029? I'm told it's 2028. I spoke to people close to the players' camp. 2028 summer is when I'm told, the deal ends. Of course, there can be club options. Of course, it can therefore be billed as the extra year. But I'm told 2028 is the juncture. And in summer, there'll be 2, not 3 years left on his deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. We're seeing Spurs a lot now actually undisclosed lengths of contracts. So again, it's one of those things. How much do we know really in terms of fans out there around the lengths of contracts? I mean, look, it's concerning to hear the news about Van der Ven. I mean, although you say, Ben, it's not a concern right now. I think the reality is, the reality is at the moment, look, we'd love to sit and say, mathematically, Spurs could of course still finish in the Champions League spots in the Premier League, but obviously our form, which has been shown certainly recently, would give you no indication or hope that Tottenham can finish inside the top 5. So on the basis of Tottenham achieving Champions League football next season, they'd have to win the Champions League, which I know some have been joking around saying, well, based on our form in Europe, is that impossible? I mean, this would be quite a crazy club to finish 17th. If we do finish 17th and then win the Champions League, I can't personally see it, but I guess we'll have to see.
But what I would say is that this is a very considered player who will want to see project moving in the right direction. So if Tottenham miss out on Champions League, he may have other offers, but if Tottenham's form between now and the end of the season is Champions League, and that means that they finish 6th, and then they go deep into this Champions League, that's the kind of evidence that shows you things are moving in the right direction. And in that scenario, it would likely mean Thomas Frank stays. So you've got full continuity there. So this is where clarity will come later, because even if Van der Ven wanted to discuss new terms now, he's thinking, who exactly is going to sign it off? Who do we negotiate with? Why rush it? Of course, if you're Vinay, the CEO, or other senior figures at the club, you'd love to just have that win of going, the window's shut, Van der Ven staying. That's a massive investment. It's a huge boost to the football club. You move on, and in an ideal world, you stick with your manager. But players don't want to fit into that neat narrative. Why would Van der Ven make a decision on his future when he'll still have time left on the contract in the summer? And in the gap between now and the summer, he can see exactly what direction of travel Tottenham are heading in.
Yeah, this is where I say to you in our relationship, Ben, the last 6-7 years, where I say to you, Ben, you aren't the problem, but we might be the problem with Tottenham, where it just feels, I mean, at the moment, it feels like a bit of an inside job right now. This football club, I have got no words in terms of what is happening to Spurs in general. Jamie, I'll hand back to you, because again, there's been a number of players still being linked with a move away from Spurs. Let's hand back to you, Jay, and get the latest update on those.
Yeah, one of them is the goalkeeper situation. I think we did mention it earlier that Spurs might look to upgrade on that. But on Guillermo Vicario, what's kind of your understanding of his situation and whether Spurs might look to upgrade him and potential targets? Do we know of any names that Spurs might look to bring in?
Yeah, the name that I'd sort of heard was Mike Maignan as one possibility for Tottenham, and we know Chelsea had looked in the past. Now Maignan is in talks to extend, which is interesting because during the Club World Cup, he was adamant that he wasn't going to extend. So things obviously change, and it's quite a fluid situation. Therefore, there'll be a few goalkeepers available in the market over the course of the summer. I'm not aware, by the way, sometimes people ask me of Tottenham and Emi Martinez. A few people have thrown that question at me. I think Martinez could end up going somewhere in Europe, with Inter, for example, holding talks over the course of the last few weeks. Vicario is kind of backed internally for now, but it wouldn't remotely surprise me if they do explore the market for number one options over the summer as well. So it's quite a fluid situation, but as it stands, it's not a now bring a number one mid-season type scenario, but goalkeeper is there on the list, or at least it was on the list. But this is the sort of thing I mean about a lack of continuity, because it's easy to think there's no direction because there's so much flux. But actually what's happening is there's different directions. And there's a key difference to those 2 points, because lack of direction is we don't know what we're doing. We haven't got a team in place. We're swinging around and seeing where we end up. We're throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. Actually, what I'm told is that Paratici had a direction. Levy had a direction. Vinay has a direction. Nick Boscia has a direction. And Johan, to an extent, is kind of in the middle somewhere, because he was working with Paratici. So the 2 sporting directors are not going to contradict each other. But now he's the sporting director, so he needs to step out of his shadow a little bit. So Paratici was not necessarily, as a consultant at the football club, a driving force behind Thomas Frank, even though Daniel Levy was. He had more doubts. He was suggesting other names. It's not to say that he didn't, in the end, say, okay, that's the unified decision, but he was not the one driving that deal. Then Paratici was the one driving Sousa, and he came. Frank was the one driving Conor Gallagher, backed by the younger members of the Lewis family in terms of finances. So every little thing they've done has actually had a clear direction of travel, but there's conflict. So some of the conflict has gone in Paratici, and some of the conflict will be ironed out as they develop their leadership team. And that's kind of where we're at the moment. So Goalkeeper's got a big question mark over it. And it's such a specialist position that you would normally leave a final say on a goalkeeper to the manager, and we don't know if the manager is staying or going. So this is why I'm not expecting any movement on number one goalkeepers for Tottenham now, but it could become a topic of conversation in the summer.
Ben, I know we are really, really pressed for time, but I hope I'm only asking this quick question with regards to Paratici, who we brought up there again. I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, you might know this better than me, because I've not been following the Italian window or Fiorentina that closely, but I think they're already on their third deal for the month over there. So someone's doing the deals over in Fiorentina.
Yeah.
And he's meant to be working here till the end of the month. I mean, I suppose you can understand why Tottenham fans would be looking at this window thinking, this is an absolute mess. We've had you on here for the last 6-7 years, and you've always been transparent. We're lucky and blessed to have you on here. But I'm sure you can understand Spurs fans thinking, what the hell is going on at the moment? It just feels like a mess.
Yeah, and it is a bit of a mess. And that's the reality, right? When your manager's under pressure, your co-sporting director leaves, the most influential figure at the football club is ousted in some ways, almost Succession style over the summer.
Yeah.
And suddenly Johan Lang is effectively the most active sporting director without that much support. Rafi's come in, but his role is more strategic and planning and not necessarily doing your urgent or your imminent deals. And you know what? It wouldn't surprise me if they bring in another senior recruitment expert when the window shuts as well. Either go down the route of co-sporting directors or bring in somebody else in the recruitment leadership team, because right now they may be a little bit thin. All of that said, it's January. There's not every target that you would like available. Gallagher, I think, is a good signing. Sousa's what they need, even if he's more perhaps a player for the future than the now. So there's pressure on Tottenham. And if they go and do another attacker and either a 6 or potentially a defender or a backup goalkeeper, if it proves true that Kinsey's going somewhere else, by January standards, it wouldn't be a bad window, 4 senior players going through the door. So it's quite an interesting stick or twist period, because if it's just the 2 that have come in, as much as Gallagher is a top signing, it's not enough. No. If it's 4 by the end of the window, regardless of the chaos and the drama, and given the chaos and the drama, that might not be a bad window for Tottenham. So we're going to have to reserve a bit of judgment, certainly as journalists, perhaps less so as fans, and see whether the next 11 days have a exciting starting type attacker and or a number 9 that can go wide, and or a central midfielder, and or a defender. And 2 of those 4, and as long as one of them is kind of more box office and starter, and you'd say, okay, they've done all right given the circumstances, but 0 through the door between now and the window, and it probably only adds further flames to the fire.
And those flames are burning. Jamie, I am back to you.
Another player linked with the move away, Radu Dragusin, his agent has spoken about potential move to Roma. So he is, well, I mean, Radu Dragusin's agent's been very vocal ever since he got here. But as I said, Roma's one of the teams that he's linked with. Is this a player that we could see departing Spurs this month?
Dragusin is looking at options, that's for sure. And I think he wants to go and play game time. It might end up again being more for the summer, but Dragusin fancies a move to Serie A. From Tottenham's point of view, at the moment, the door's shut. And I don't think it will open unless they bring in another defender. And as Liverpool are finding with huge urgency to add another centre-back, it's tough unless you want to overpay like Man City did for Mark Gay. So at the moment, Dragusin expected to stay, but in the long run, looking for a move back to Serie A. And from Tottenham's perspective, there's a few defenders that they quite like. One is Marcus Senesi, And I would expect Tottenham to be in that conversation when he becomes a free agent during the summer. Of course, there'll be other clubs. Juventus are one of them. Chelsea might go down that route if Jeremy Jacquet doesn't arrive. So that's a name to keep an eye on. Jacobo Ramon at Como is a young defender that Tottenham are watching very closely. I actually think Real Madrid, even though he's only been at Como for 6 months in the summer, might trigger a buyback clause because it's relatively economical. I think it's only in the region of 7 million euros, or it's certainly under 10 million euros. So Real may enter that race to re-sign a player, but there's Premier League clubs, including Tottenham, interested in Jacobo Ramon. And he's one of those, I know it's a bit overused, but generational talents. He's seen as a sort of Lenny Yoro, Jeremy Jacquet, one of these players that could come straight in and make a real impact. Tottenham had Sven Botman on their radar, but he ended up extending at Newcastle United. No real surprise either. So I don't think they can really be faulted for not advancing their interest there. And then less Tottenham interested at this stage anyway, and more being offered. Axel Disasi is a winter opportunity. And I know you're shaking your head. Of course, Tottenham were genuinely, so this isn't only Chelsea offering, Spurs were genuinely trying to do that deal, remember, as we hit the deadline in which he ended up going to Aston Villa instead. So there is some historical interest there, but I'm not actually aware of Tottenham saying, yeah, we want him. It's more Chelsea offering him around. And for me, he's back in the Chelsea fold under Liam Rosinia. He's out of the bomb squad. He's training with the first team squad. And that is because he's been professional and he deserves to be there. But it kind of helps put him in the shop window as well. I think Roma and Lyon are more interested, and Bournemouth have had historical interest. I don't think Tottenham are going to bite here. So the other names are Tottenham-like. This is more a name of, do you want him? And I'm not expecting Tottenham to say yes.
I tell you what. I mean, we're at a point where if we end up with Hermansen and Disasi in the final week of the window, I'm not saying, Ben, you're saying these players are going to happen, but if these names happen, I think I'll have to retire. There's no way we can carry on, guys. I'm sorry. It is that Mick McCarthy meme. It can't get any worse than this. It can. It can. Listen, I think
there would be a couple of others, by the way, like obviously Harvey Elliott was spoken about at the beginning of the summer, but he can't play in the second half of the season. So it's pointless making a move now because he's turned out for Liverpool and Aston Villa. But Frank, and again, this is where there's different voices, which can be healthy because you want freedom to challenge. But right now, because there's so little time left in the window, you need continuity. And Frank wants to look within the Premier League. So I think some of these names from within the Premier League are players that Frank's saying, get, because they can have instant impact, even if it's a bit more short-termist. Go and find a loan, go and spend 25, 30 million on a player from within the Premier League that can just go out there and hit the ground running. And that's why I think a lot of inquiries are taking place to say, okay, so there's that paradox in all of this of Frank is playing a big part in a window and yet is still somewhat on a game-by-game basis. And that, unfortunately, sums up where Tottenham are at the moment.
Yeah. Well, let's ask you about one player that, from what we're reports are hearing, is keen to get away. Who could blame him right now? Because there's about hundreds of thousands of Spurs fans that would love to also be keen to get away, but we're stuck with them. And that currently is Mathis Tel. Now, there's been suggestions that he's reportedly planning his farewell from Tottenham, with reports suggesting that the only way that will make him reconsider his future at Tottenham if Tottenham were to sack Thomas Frank. Now, Tel is reportedly bemused at being left out the Champions League squad for the second time this season. Obviously, he was not included in the initial squad by Thomas Frank in September, but he was eventually added to replace a previously injured Dominic Solanke. Of course, Dominic Solanke is now back in a Spurs shirt, did score, of course, every night, which maybe justifies the decision from Frank. But we are hearing that alongside Paris FC, further clubs from France as well, along with England and Spain, are also after him, whilst the Bundesliga return is currently off the table. You know, he has only scored 3 goals in 20 appearances, and he's just started 6 Premier League games so far since he's come to the football club. What do you think, Ben, genuinely, between now and the end of the window, how likely is it that Mathis Tel gets his move that it feels his camp is continuing to push for?
Yeah, Mathis Tel definitely was surprised and bemused to be omitted from the Champions League squad. Thomas Frank and Spurs made the decision to include Dom Solanke. He scored. They won the game. So Frank's decision is somewhat vindicated. And I don't know, we'd have to ask the chat. I would imagine that the majority, or certainly 50-50, would be saying, yeah, we would have picked Solanke over Tel as well.
Yeah.
But Tel had started the last 4 games. So you can totally understand why the player feels he did everything possible and wasn't included. But I think for that game, Solanke was what Tottenham needed. He scored. It was an important goal, and they went on to win the game. So you can't really blame Tel for being disillusioned, but you can't blame Thomas Frank for making a tough call. And he made the right call because it paid off, and the player that he included in the squad scored. So right now, Tottenham don't want Tel to leave. Tel is open to options, but it's almost impossible to give an accurate representation of the player side because, as you say, if Frank goes, his perspective may change entirely, in the same way that all the reporting on Kobbie Mainoo was around Amorim, loan, game time, unhappiness, tension. But then you're going, well, what might happen in the summer? And it's like, Amorim's not lasted until the summer, and Kobbie Mainoo plays in the Manchester derby, and overnight, every single problem, every single story, every single direction of travel completely changes. And Tel is in a similar position as well. If it continues like this with Thomas Frank, left out of the Champions League, in and out of the side, etc., then absolutely he'll explore his options. But I think he's also prepared to just bide his time and see what happens with Thomas Frank. And Tottenham don't want to let him go in the next 11 days. So I think this is a stalemate for now. And unless we get a massive, massive surprise, there's a very strong chance that Tottenham block any kind of Tel departure in these final days of the window.
A player that kind of, I think, upset quite a few fans yesterday during the Borussia Dortmund match was Randall Kolo Muani. Now, this is the last player that we are going to ask you about, Ben, but yeah, it's not been a great loan move for him, really. He scored those 2 goals against Paris Saint-Germain in the Champions League, but in the Premier League, yet to get off the mark. It's been a pretty underwhelming loan move for him. He's been played on the left as well. Yes, he can obviously play there, but it seems like he wants to be more of a striker. Randall Kolo Muani, is this a deal that could get cut short?
Yeah, it hasn't quite worked, has it? And that leaves Tottenham in a reasonably difficult position because PSG don't want him back, and they're not going out of their way in the same way Liverpool are not going out of their way to bring Harvey Elliott back. So this is kind of a Tottenham problem as it stands. And even if there was an appetite to explore a solution, that still won't come without adding an attacker first. So Kolo Muani stays unless Tottenham find another attacker. And we have to wait and see if someone arrives before we understand if there is any kind of last-minute solution for Kolo Muani. The only thing that I've heard more for summer than necessarily now is Lazio making an inquiry. And then obviously he was loaned at Juventus, and prior to the Tottenham move, he would have liked that to become permanent. And Juve, by the way, are still looking for some kind of forward or attacker because their loan plus obligation for Jean-Philippe Mateta was rejected by Crystal Palace. So as we get the merry-go-round with Milan maybe looking still, even though they've made a few additions, Juve needing an attacker, and a few other clubs in and around the market at major European teams still potentially being alert to opportunities, you might get a little bit of the merry-go-round where we get a twist here. But I think Tottenham's perspective is really clear that they want Kolo Muani to get going at Tottenham Hotspur, and they don't want to send him back to PSG without an attacker coming through the door first.
Well, what is clear, Ben, it's going to be a very interesting next 10, 11 days in terms of what comes in this window. You said earlier that you could see the club potentially bringing in a couple of players. Alongside that, how likely is it, do you think, in 5-6 months' time when you're back here in the summer, fingers crossed, how How much do you believe you'll be sitting and talking about Thomas Frank still being the Spurs head coach? What's your gut feeling on that?
My gut feeling is that Thomas Frank won't be the head coach heading into next season. And I'd love to be proven wrong, by the way, because I like Frank. I've interacted with Frank. I've interviewed Frank. And his tactics and his style and his management, if you go back to Brentford, all really strong. But for whatever reason, he doesn't look a fit at Tottenham. And that's not always on the manager. That can be on the owners. That can be on the culture.
Yeah.
So if Frank departs, I don't think we can put it all on him.
Definitely not. Definitely
But
not.
I think there comes a point in time where you can't keep persisting with something after giving it what now has been months and months and months of trying. So Dortmund's great, but it's only one performance. If they beat Burnley, they should be beating Burnley. It's Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. So great if they beat Burnley, but you don't get as much credit in the bank for that. So for Frank to stay in a job, I think he has to beat Burnley, and then he has to beat Frankfurt, and then Tottenham qualify for the knockout stage of the Champions League. And then you can go out in the market, and then you know that you've got more Champions League football, and then you know that you've got a little bit more money in the bank, and then you've got 3 wins on the bounce. And then, of course, Tottenham play Man City, where they've got a good record against, and Manchester United away, which at the moment is a tricky game. But those runs of fixtures are dicey for Frank, because despite the history with Man City, on paper you think Frankfurt away, where they could go from being in the top 8 to only being in a playoff. And then the way the draw is, I mean, I've not looked at it exactly, but if you're in the top half of that next 8, you might be getting like a PSG or a Man City or somebody. Like, the fixtures are so unpredictable. So away at Frankfurt, tricky. Home to Man City, tricky. Away at Man United, tricky. Home to Newcastle, tricky. North London derby. And if Thomas Frank hits a bad run of form in those games heading up to the North London derby, I'd be staggered if they let it drag on and give him a North London derby. So he still feels like he's fighting, and I mean fighting, despite the Dortmund win, to get to that North London derby. If he gets to that North London derby, it means that they've gone on a brilliant run of form. And then you're thinking, end of the season. But as I said to you before, I think the run of fixtures, coupled with the mood, coupled with the culture and the mismatch with Frank, mean that Dortmund's not enough. And there is still a very realistic chance, unfortunately, that Thomas Frank will either not see out the season or will not be the Tottenham manager next season.
Well, one thing this show has definitely clarified is that I did a holiday very, very fast. But we can't thank you enough for your time. We know how busy you are right now. I mean, you can see obviously the concern from Spurs fans.
Oh, I mean, it must feel like doom and gloom and the world is caving in. I mean, you see the comments, and of course, Tottenham fans, they want good news. But as a journalist, it's not about selling a false dream. You know, I could go, Tottenham are going to sign a starting left winger, a number 9, an amazing goalkeeper, a centre back, and a number 6. They're going to get rid of Kolo Muani and Tel. They're going to win the Champions League, and they're going to finish in the top 5. And Frank is bulletproof because they realise with 100 million in January investment, they're going to be world beaters. And everyone will go, God, that Ben Jacobs is so positive and a great journalist. He's told us exactly what I want to hear. But if the mood of the Tottenham fans is doom and gloom, then that's the reality. And if that's the reality, that should be reflected in our reporting.
100%. And just so we touch on that point, when Ben said about the news that he was going to share to us, it was about Mickey van der Ven, just to be clear, the fact that Mickey van der Ven, as you said, Ben, your understanding is there's a valuation of it would be a
British transfer record,
Yeah. If Spurs do let him go, which, I mean, based on how we're playing right now, I mean, you couldn't 100% put your life in that Mickey will be a Tottenham player next season. However, stranger things have happened. I want to say a massive thank you to the wonderful Ben Jacobs. Ben, we'll have you back in the summer, where who knows what Spurs will look like come then, and where they'll be playing in what league. I just don't know. Ben,
win the Champions League and get relegated? Would you take that?
Ben, can we win the Champions League? I mean,
yeah, it's that strange season. Like, I know it's ridiculous to say, but I don't think people thought they would win the Europa League either. It's just a weird quirk. And sometimes when things are not going well, you batten down the hatches in a knockout tournament. And just because it's a different style, different opposition, and a knockout, albeit obviously over 2 legs once we get to that stage, maybe they are just a better cup team at the moment under Thomas Frank.
Yeah. So just so we're clear, Thomas Frank could go on to be Tottenham's greatest manager in modern history by winning the Champions League, but he's currently the most unpopular manager, it feels, inside and outside.
Yeah, but that was Ange as well, right? That he stayed a bit longer and a bit longer and a bit longer, even though the direction of travel was a change. He won a trophy, he had a mic drop moment, and he left.
Yeah. Different auras, 100%, but it is crazy right now being a Tottenham fan. Ben, we can't thank enough as always. We know how busy you are. And to come and spare us your time talking about Tottenham, even that, I tell you, that deserves some credit out there. Ben, where can we find the wonderful work you do? Tell everyone where they can find what you're up to at the moment and what your plan is headed into this last 8-9 days of this window.
Yeah, so TalkSport broadcast, Gimme Sport writing, at Jacobs Ben on X, Ben David Jacobs on Instagram and Facebook. And interestingly, so I don't know how it's going to pan out, for the last 5 days of the window, I'm actually doing Winter Olympics. And therefore, anything I break will basically be from a Milan mountain somewhere, possibly with reception, possibly not. So first time mid-season where a window will shut and I'll be simultaneously doing the Winter Olympics as well.
Ben, we wish you all the very best with that. I'm sure a lot of us Spurs fans out there would love to go anywhere right now and hibernate and go and tune into the Olympics more than suffering with Tottenham. But as always, it's a genuine pleasure to have you on. We can't thank you enough. We know how busy you are. Guys, we have got to stick together. It's tricky times right now as Spurs fans, but we are all in it together and there is no escape. I want to say a massive thank you to my co-host alongside me, Jamie Brown, over at the Daily Hotspur. I can just remind you, Into Midnight was hearing the sassy, potentially a player Tottenham might look at. Not that he's going to sign. Not that he's going to sign. A potential player. Offered, right? Offered. Not they're going to buy him. Offered. Let's brace ourselves. Who knows what's going to come these next 8-9 days this window. Jamie, thank you so much. Ben, thank you so much. Everybody out there, thank you so much for your support and unwavering love for this show. We'll be back with you, I'm sure, very, very soon. From us all, please keep safe, keep well. And as always,